Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So this is the second part of a three-part video where I'm starting a diary about how I'm growing lots of food this year to feed my family. So the first part of the video I uploaded yesterday, and that was more about the tour of the garden and the growing environment, so the outside vegetable garden and the inside polytunnel and greenhouse, whereas this video will be focusing more on the seed sowing. So I've organised all the seeds I'm going to be sowing today. This is the selection I'm going to go for. These are all basically plants that don't mind cooler temperatures, and they'll be growing this time of year without too much of an issue. We will have them in the polytunnel just to make sure that they're warm enough to get germinated, and then we'll just be keeping them here until the worst of the winds go, and then we'll plant them outside. So we've got things like Mons 2, garden peas and broad beans. They'll be going outdoors. I'm doing a few more leeks as well. I do have some already that are growing, but I'd like to get a few more started. It's a little bit late for leeks. They are a very long season crop. Ideally I'd start them in January, February time, but we're a bit late getting some extra seeds, so I'll start them as well. Now we've also got one ornamental I'm going to start now, which is Ami. That's quite a nice one. It's got these lovely white flowers, looks a bit like cow parsley, and it flowers for most of the summer, attracts lots of nice beneficial insects, and it can get quite big even though the seedlings are so small. So that one is a very small seedling, so I need to start that quite early. That's why I'm going to start that now. I will do a lot more ornamentals later in the year, but with ornamentals it's not such an issue for me to start them early, because if they're a bit smaller I just get slightly less flowers, whereas with crops that are edible, if I start them too late, either we don't have any crop at all, or the crop is just reduced and we don't get as much food. So we have to prioritise the edible plants. So when it comes to brassicas, we've got a decent selection. I might get a few more. Certainly later in the year I'll be planting kale. We tend to use kale as a winter crop because the winters here, as I say, are quite bad and nothing really grows over winter. What we tend to do is grow a lot of cabbage and kale, and then we can harvest them over the winter time when nothing else is available. So I'll be planting the kale later on in the season. I find if I plant them now, they get really big plants and they tend to get damaged by the winter winds. So I normally sow them around May or June time, and that way we have slightly smaller plants, but then by the time autumn comes they're a bit bigger and established, and they're just not too big to survive our winters. So we've got a couple of types of cauliflower that I'll be growing. This one's actually a successional mix, so there's actually about 5 varieties in that mix. We've also got kohlrabi. We've got 2 types of purple and the green. The purple is amazingly some very old seeds. You can see this actually 2008 they were manufactured, 2010 they went out of date, but I find with brassicas it doesn't really matter how old the seeds are, the seeds just always seem to keep really well. There's some plants like carrots and parsnips where the seeds, unless you get new seeds every year, they won't really grow too well, but with brassicas I find even the ancient seeds, I've had seeds that are 20-30 years old still germinate on me. So never throw out a packet of seeds, I would say, if you still got seeds in them. I've planted some seeds that were 30 years old and they actually grew no problem. They were ornamentals, wallflowers, but if you have got seeds, it's worth a try. I wouldn't just throw them out just because the packet says that they're bad. So we've also got some broccoli, 2 types. We've got purple sprouting, which is just got all these little florets, and then we've got the kind of classic Calabrese type that you normally see in the supermarket. And then we've also got some tree spinners. We grew this last year. It grew a lot bigger than we were expecting. We thought in our climate it wouldn't do as well. It grew absolutely massive. I'll put some pictures up now. It grew probably to about 7 or 8 feet, even though we kept cutting it down. So we'll definitely be growing that again. And despite the winds here, it managed to hold its own pretty well. So it has quite strong stems and good root system. So grow some more of that, but just not quite as many because it did so well. And then here in the polytunnel, I won't be planting these in seed pots. These will be broadcast onto the ground. Basically the bed on the left here, that's still empty, so I need to get that planted up. The bed on the right is already sown. The other beds I might just leave until later in the year. What I want to try and do is get an early crop, make the most of the beds while it's still empty, and then by the time the early crop's harvested, it'll be time to put out the tropical plants around about May time. So in those beds what I'm going to be putting is a few more radishes. I'll try this icicle type, which is like a very long radish. A little bit different to your normal one. Some spring onions as well. Now they might take a little bit too long, same with the beetroot, they might take a bit too long as well. But I'd like to try them anyway, and even before fully harvesting them I can plant the tropical plant in between, because by that stage the tropical plants will be quite small and they shouldn't be overshadowing these for a while, and I can start thinning these out when they're very small beetroot around the tropical plants, and then leave the ones further away to ripen and get a bit bigger. And then turnips as well, but turnips, they're always really fast. You can probably get harvested in 1 month in optimum conditions. So that's what I'll be sowing now. Now there are some plants that we have to sow direct in the garden. Most of them we start early inside the polytunnel to get a head start on the season. But when it comes to carrots and parsnips, basically most root vegetables, if you start them in a seed tray and transplant them, you disturb the roots and you don't end up with nice straight roots. You get really branched roots and it just doesn't work well. So carrots and parsnips we tend to grow outside, direct sown. And there's a few things like salad crops as well, like lettuce, spinach. We direct sow them also, because if they get any stress with transplanting, they tend to go into shock, then they just start flowering and you lose all the leaf crops. So best to do them direct sown. Anything that kind of goes into shock and can start flowering too early, I would direct sow them. So I'd like to show you the process that I tend to use for when it comes to sowing seeds. So in order to keep the amount of work down to a minimum, especially at this early stage, and also to save on seed and cutting compost, what I normally do is, instead of getting a big tray either like this or individual cells and planting 1 or 2 seeds in each cell, what I tend to do is I just get a pot like this and I plant about 30 or 40 seeds in the pot and then wait for it to germinate. Now the reason I do that is because at this seedling stage it's very important that the temperatures are well controlled. And if I was to do it in large number of cells like this, and sometimes we actually do them in massive trays, in individual pots such as this here, where you have 18 in a tray, and that just takes up a huge amount of space. And at this critical time of year when you're really struggling for the amount of incubated space that you've got where it's nice and warm. Now let's apologise if you hear a lot of noise in the background. We're next to an RAF base and there's a lot of fighter jets flying around. So it just helps to save on the space to just put maybe 30 or 40 plants instead of in 3 or 4 of those cells, just into a small pot like this. That then allows us just to keep that in a smaller area, saves on the seed and cutting compost, which is a bit harder to come by and a bit more expensive. And then once these have germinated, just as the second lot of leaves come out after the seedling stage, and then separate them out and I plant them into trays or individual pots and then grow them on. Now it's important to use seed and cutting compost because normal compost has a lot of feed added to it, and that feed can have high salt levels in it, and that what it does is it burns the young roots on the young plants as they're just starting to germinate. So that will damage them and can stop germination being successful, or stop them becoming established anyway. So it's important to use seed and cutting compost. Also it tends to be a much finer mix. You can see here there's not any too large lumps. These bigger lumps, if I break them up, it's actually quite a nice fine mix. Most multi-purpose compost will have a much thicker, coarser mix. So this here is an example of some multi-purpose compost. As you can see, it does break down quite nice, but there's some larger fibres, especially with the more recent peat-free mixes. The old peat mixes, they were also bad for having lumps, but they weren't quite as bad. I find now that we've gone peat-free to be a bit more environmentally friendly, you get a lot more of these wood mixes, but sometimes, depending on the company, you can get quite large wood fibres or sticks like that, and if that sits on top of a seed, it can cause the seed to not be successful, because as it tries to push up, it will come against something hard like a piece of wood like that, and it just won't be able to grow through. So it's important to use seed and cutting compost. And because every seed and cutting compost isn't perfect, I also use a riddle as well. So I tend to fill the bottom of the pot, if it's a good seed and cutting compost, just with the straight seed and cutting compost. I then lay the seeds on top and then dust it down with some riddled compost, and I just bury them probably about 1/2 centimetre thick. It really depends on the type of seed. The bigger the seed, the deeper it can be buried. So I do that generally, and that just keeps it a nice coating of compost to keep it nice and damp, but at the same time it's not too thick and it's not too lumpy that the seeds can't grow out of it. Now the only thing you do need to watch for using this method is if you have a lot of seeds, sometimes the whole compost can get crusty on the top and the whole thing lifts up with a number of seedlings. So I did actually have that problem with this one here. I did actually break it so they're coming through, but you can see some of the compost was lifted up by the seeds themselves. If that starts happening, what you need to do is keep the compost a bit more damp so it doesn't form that crust on the surface, and if you can, just gently break the crust like I've done here. You can see all the ones that were underneath the crust because they're yellow, they haven't got the green chlorophyll yet. So that's just something to watch out for. But if you have good riddled compost and it is seed and cutting compost, it's less likely that that should occur. So I'm going to go ahead now and start getting all these seeds done. Now, as I say, another reason for doing it in an individual pot like this instead of loads of them, as well as keeping down the compost, is just the amount of time it takes. So I've got loads of seeds that I want to sow today. Timing is quite critical, especially if you're this far north and the season is quite short. You really don't want to be shortening the season anymore by missing out with sowing a bit later. So in this way I can probably sow all these seed packets really quite quickly in just in space of an hour or two. whereas if I was to do it in individual pots with individual seeds, it would take me the whole day or maybe 2 or 3 days. So that's another thing that really speeds it up. It does add a bit of time later on in the season, because instead of leaving them in these pots for a few months and then putting them in the garden, you then have to carefully transplant the seeds individually into the larger growing on pots. So that adds a bit of time, but at least by that stage you can then use normal compost, because you don't have to worry about seed and cutting compost. And the other advantage is you can use recycled compost. So we have a lot of recycled compost. Maybe plants will die, or the plants were grown in a pot and we don't need them the next year, so we get a lot of old compost. I often use that for a lot of my seedlings once they're a little bit older and they can handle normal compost. So this just keeps the cost down, and with some plants I might even use soil from the garden. Just depends on the type of plant, but I wouldn't use it normally for the actual seedlings. The reason being, it could have a bit of extra feed in there, although I know this one won't because it's quite old compost. But the main reason is it could have a lot of weed seeds, and when the plants start to germinate, sometimes it's hard to tell what's a weed and what isn't. And it's especially a problem if you've been using this for seed and cutting compost in the past and you've got some old seeds from last year, and then you might get some seeds coming up which look the same but they're actually different. So for example, you might have a broccoli instead of a cauliflower, and then that can just be a bit confusing. It's not a big issue, but what might happen is you have too many cauliflowers one year and not enough broccoli. So ideally do reuse compost if you can. Keeps the cost down, better for the environment, but just use it for slightly older plants, not for starting seeds in. You can use it for starting seeds in, but then you have to sterilize it using heat, which is quite a bit of work. So I tend just to use seed and cutting compost, and I just keep the volume down by using a small amount at a time. So the only plants I'll be doing differently are the peas and beans. Now these are really large seed plants. The broad beans in particular are very large, so you can see the size of the seed there. It's a really large seed. So I just do these, instead of doing them crammed into a small pot, because if you had that many large seeds in a pot, it just wouldn't really work. So I put these in individually, and because they're such big seeds, they don't really have that same issue with having lumps in the compost or having too much feed in the compost. So I quite often just put these straight into multi-purpose compost, as long as it's not one with a huge amount of feed, or I actually just use garden soil, which I know is of good quality, and that's just fine for peas and beans. Anything else with large seeds, that's normally fine. So I normally that's what I go ahead and do. With peas and beans, what I also often do is I plant them in toilet rolls. So I've got some old kitchen rolls there. I do have a lot more toilet rolls that I'll be using soon, and the reason for that is they don't like their roots to get disturbed. If their roots get disturbed, it really sets them back. So when you put them in a toilet roll, you can then transplant the whole toilet roll, put it in the ground without disturbing the roots. The toilet roll will get soft with the water and start to degrade over time. The roots can then push through it and grow, and there won't be any real root disturbance. So that's quite a good method that I also like to use. So one more thing I'd like to add is labeling. It's very important that you label all your seedlings. If you don't label your seedlings, you won't really know what you're growing. It might be fine for some plants, such as like broad beans compared with spring onion. It's really obvious what they are when they come up. But if you've got really similar plants, such as like broccoli or curly kale or cauliflower, when they're in the young plant stage, until they really come to the harvesting stage, it can be very hard to differentiate what the plants are. So it's a good idea to keep them labelled so you don't get anything mixed up. And it also helps with your numbering. So if you have a pot full of broccoli and it hasn't germinated well, you then know you need to resow the broccoli plant. If you don't know what the plant is, you might put in some more cauliflower, and then you're going to have loads of cauliflower and barely any broccoli. So you want to make sure that you're always keeping in mind how many plants you want, and it's good to work out how many plants you'll need for the year, work out how much space you've got in the garden, then sow extra than what you actually need, because you'll always lose a few seeds. Basically, you won't get 100% germination with every batch of seeds, and when it comes to transplanting them and putting them in the garden, there's pest diseases, drought, there's all sorts of things that can kill them as well. So always sow more seeds than what you need. And then if you do have any spares, you can either find a little bit of space in the garden to cram them in, or you can give them away to friends and neighbours, or worst case scenario, you can just throw them out. But ideally you can reuse them. So always try and grow a little bit extra, but you do want to be economical with the seeds at the same time. So don't grow like 10 times more than you need, just maybe grow double of what you need. And as you go on and you know how many crops you normally lose as the years go by, you can then kind of calculate it better for your situation. So for example, I know with broad beans I have very good success rate. They don't normally die off, so I don't normally plant much more than what I actually need. When it comes to other plants, such as some of the brassicas, which can get hit by pests quite bad, I tend to grow double the amount that I need, just to make sure that I've got plenty. So I'll be labelling them up, writing the name on each one, but I also put the date of when the plants were sown. So you can see here, this is one from last year. This was just some butternut squash. I put the type of plant, which is squash, the variety as well, and then on the back what I do is I put a sowing date. So it's important to put the date that you sowed the plant, because you need to know if the plant hasn't germinated after say a month, that batch of seeds was bad, and you need to throw out that batch of seeds and start again. If you don't have the date on it, the problem is you don't know how long it's been sown for. You don't know if you need to restart with a new batch of seeds, or you just need to wait longer for those seeds to germinate. So putting the date on them is always good, and it's also very handy for the next year. So for example, because I don't have a diary, I can look back at the dates on these labels. I can see I sowed this on the 29th of March. I can then look at my photos, see when I actually planted them out in the garden, and figure out if that was too early or too late. So that's quite a good thing to be able to look at. And when it comes to labels, I don't normally buy any labels. I just use bits of plastic that I have from packaging, or from something like containers like yogurt pots. You can just cut a yogurt pot up on the inside where it's not printed. You can write on that. We also use loads of lollipop sticks as well from ice creams over the summer. There's loads of different types of ways of making your own labels. So generally I don't buy any labels. I just use old recycled things, and then I can reuse them for next year. So things like wood, you can just sand it down. You can also sand down plastic. I don't tend to like sanding down plastic because you get a lot of plastic dust, and that's never really very good. So I just use hand sanitizer and a bit of tissue, and that tends to take off any of the ink if you use permanent marker. So I'll go ahead now and I'll start sowing all these seeds, and I'll just show you how they are once they're planted up. So I've now sown 9 batches of seeds. I'd like to show you a few more tips that I was thinking of as I was potting them up. So one of the things is, if you do throw your seed packets away, say you've emptied the seed packet, I wouldn't throw it away completely. What I tend to do is I just put them here. So these are all the seeds that I've sown this year, and the packets have been emptied. That way, if I think, oh, this year the crop has been bad or been good, I can look at what variety I had, and if it's done well, I'll take a mental note or put it in a notebook and make sure we use that variety for next year. And if it's a bad variety, then I'll make sure I don't use it again, or I'll try and figure out if it's the variety that's been the problem or something else that's caused the issues. So I tend to try quite a lot of different varieties all the time, and that way I can find the ones that grow best in my particular climate or situation, or the one that just tastes the nicest or give the highest yield. So I try quite a few different varieties all the time. Often what I might do is I'll use my favourite one and then just do a few of something different just to see what they're like. And when it comes to sowing the seeds, you don't want to sow all the seeds that you have, although you want to sow as many as you need. You want to keep a few in reserve. The reason being, something might happen. You might have a late frost, or there might be a lot of pest and disease problems, or you're just watering too much or too little. So if you lose your entire batch of the first sown seeds, you at least have something to fall back on, which you can sow a month later or so, just so that you have something to yield. If you were to lose everything, then obviously you'd have to buy new seeds, and quite often later in spring the seeds are sold out, and so they're hard to get. So that's something you want to bear in mind. Make sure you got some seeds set aside just in case, worst case scenario, you lose all your initial sowings. And I just wanted to also sow the Riddler here. So this is decent quality seed and cutting compost. I would say actually quite high quality, but as you can see, I've riddled it and it was absolutely full of stones. So I haven't used a huge amount of compost. You're probably only talking maybe about 2 litres worth of compost from that, but if you have a look at the actual riddle, it's absolutely full of stones. So that just gives you a good indication that even if you get decent seed and cutting compost, it's always a good idea, if you can, get yourself a riddle and riddle them out. If you can't get a riddle, try and find a sieve which has slightly larger holes than a normal average sieve. You can use a normal sieve, but you'll just find out that you're probably riddling half of the material out, and you don't need to get the absolute tiniest little pieces of stone and stick out. You just want to get the largest ones. So I don't use my very finest sieve on this. This is about medium-sized riddle, and I find that works well. So if you can invest in a riddle, they're very useful. And now when it comes to watering the plants, make sure you've got a watering can with a very fine rose. I tend to use this one here. The rose on it is nice and fine. So when I come to watering the plants, what you want to do is you want to start watering to the side, because sometimes the first lot of water that comes out lumpy. So once it's flowing nicely, you then want to go from a little bit of height and just get it nicely damped down. Now if you were using a watering can which had a much larger rose, so you got water flying out with much bigger water droplets, the problem is they will wash away the seeds, and then you might lose a lot of your seeds, or they'll be buried too deep, or they'll be washed out and they'll become too shallow. So if you can, use a watering can with a fine hose water it from a decent height, but not too high so it doesn't fall down excessively hard. And one thing you can do is, if you're careful, you can make small holes in the top of a drinking water bottle, and then you can use the lid of the drinking water bottle with a water bottle held upside down to kind of spray the water out. That's a really good way of, if you've got really fine seeds, to for making that work. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put these in this greenhouse and zip it up. That'll keep it nice and humid, but also it should warm up in sunny days. At this time of year, these seedlings, they're all cold crops, so they're basically crops that grow in a cold climate, and they can start quite early, such as brassicas and leeks. So the germination temperature of about 15-20 degrees should be fine. So this will be that temperature in the daytime, so they'll be going in here. And if I don't have enough space to put them in here, what I sometimes do is I put the seeds in these little propagators. You can just get these from a lot of supermarkets or garden centres. The handy thing with these is, if you don't have any source of heating, but you've got a sunny windowsill, you can put this on the top. It acts like a mini greenhouse. It warms up and it'll keep the plants nice and warm, and you got the added benefit that it stops the compost from drying out too quickly. So I quite like these. These are quite useful if you don't have any more advanced setup. You can just get a mini greenhouse effect, and it's quite useful having that cover on it, because on a sunny day the compost can dry out really quick. So you might go to work in the morning, water the plants, and then by the time you come back in the afternoon they've dried out and died. So this just helps with that. The only thing you do need to watch is if you've got strong midday sun, which you often get in late spring, this can get really hot and it could actually cook your plants. So keep this away from the midday sun. With all seedlings, they need a decent amount of light. We have it here in the polytunnel, so there's not any shading at all. Good light levels. The seeds grow nice and strong. They don't grow too leggy. You can, in fact, you can see on these ones here, they're not too leggy. Quite nice short seedlings. You want to give the seeds really good light levels, because if it's too dark, they just get really leggy and they start to die. So you want to have a nice bright windowsill, ideally with some direct sunlight. But if you are living somewhere with really hot sun, or it's later in the year, maybe like late spring or summer, then you want to make sure that the midday sun, you do shelter the plants from that, otherwise it could crisp them up and dry them out. So I'm going to go ahead now and sow some more plants. I'm going to get the toilet roll method for this, and then I'll be talking about the bed on the left here, where I'll be sowing with my plants over here, which will be the spring onion, beetroot, radish, and also some early maturing turnip as well. And they will just be direct sown straight into the bed. So because this video is getting quite long, I'm going to show you the sections where I sow the plants out directly into the bed, and also the sowing of the toilet roll method with the beans and the peas in a separate video, which will be a part 3 to this food growing video. And this should be out about 1 or 2 days after this video is out. So you should be able to find a link for this at the end of this video on one of the end cards.